in 1875, and it gradually acquired the territory around it, and they built up a state or a community called the Rus, and the language was Russian language, and so that state existed for approximately 300 years until the 12th century, when the Tartars came in and dominated and controlled for 300 years. Now, this is one of the myths that I want to impart to you. Here in the U.S. and in Western Europe, we're all taught that the Mongolian tribes, which are called Tartars, were hordes of horsemen. However, if you talk to Mongolians, it's just the opposite. These people that came from Mongolia came to establish statehood for the people of the Rus, because they were living under feudalism, and there were constant attacks on the Tartar tribes in Mongolia. So they came here to help these people achieve statehood. Now, but by the 15th century, the Muscovites were tired of the Tartars, and they were constantly having wars, and by the 16th century, they were able to drive the Tartars out of Moscow and Kiev, with Ivan IV. Ivan IV was able to drive them out, and in fact, Ivan IV became the first Tsar of the Russian state in Moscow, and Moscow took over as head of the Rus people and replaced the Kiev. Now, in 1552, Ivan crushed the Tartar stronghold in Kazan, and the Russian Empire expanded into Siberia. The Tsars took over Siberia, as well as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and as well as Turkestan. Now, the Russian Empire existed from 1552 to 1917. And what happened in 1917? The Bolshevik Revolution happened, and 1 week after the Russian Revolution of October the 7th, on November the 7th, 1 week later, the Russian Soviet government issued a declaration of the rights of the people of Russia, putting an end to national oppression of the Russian Empire. And they said that all these other people that were not Russians, Ukrainians, Belarus, Poles, the people of the Caucasus, Armenians, Kazakhs, were all allowed to take control and have equality of rights with the Russian people and have their own countries, because there were separate nationalities, in line with the Leninist principle that a nation is entitled to their own control, their own territory. And so in December of 1917, the Russian government recognized separate countries that were formed, including the Ukraine, the Belarus, Armenia, and the people of the Caucasus. And in the same year, these countries followed the Russian example and declared their country Soviet. Ukraine formed the Soviet, Belarus formed the Soviet, and so did Mongolia. The next year, 1918, Russia Soviet was attacked by the British, American, French, and German imperialists. The local capitalists and landlords joined these foreign imperialists, and the war lasted 3 years and devastated areas of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Finally, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Russia decided that they needed to make peace, otherwise they were going to lose all these republics. So they sent a delegation to Brest-Litovsk, which was a city right on the border between Poland and the Belarus. And the delegation was headed by Trotsky. And so when Trotsky went, did he follow the directions of the government and the party to make peace, to sue for peace? No, he did not make, he didn't follow the instructions. Instead, he came out with the policy, neither war nor peace. And he didn't sign a peace treaty. So the Germans said, oh yeah? So they attacked. Now Lenin said that Trotsky's position was a huge setback for the revolutionary forces in Germany. And you could read this in the history of the Communist Party Bolshevik, as well as History of the World, written by the Russians. So he was removed from the delegation, and I think Wyszynski was sent in his place, and the peace was finally made to end that war. However, there was something else that was going on, and this is really important. It's very important on what's going on now. There was the Polish-Ukrainian War of 1918 and 1919. There was a conflict between the forces of the Second Polish Republic and the West Ukrainian People's Republic for control over Eastern Galicia after the dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The Polish landlords wanted to control Lvov and all areas up to the Zabrant River in western Ukraine. And so there was a huge war that went on for over 2 years. And eventually the area of Lvov and western Slovakia was given to Poland, to Polish landlords who had control over the Ukrainian peasants. Now we never hear anything about this in the news. So they were allowed to keep it for 20 years. For 20 years they were allowed to keep it. And so what happened in 1939? People remember? There was a famous Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement. And what does the Western history books say? That the Soviet Union stole half of Poland from Poland. Well, that was a lie. Why? Because that territory of Western Ukraine belonged to the Ukraine. and the western part of Belarus belonged to the Belarus. So the Red Army drove the Polish forces out. 250,000 were captured or driven off, and this territory was given back to the Ukraine. And the kulaks, these Polish landlords, went back, had to go back to Poland and live on their own lands. And an interesting fact that Germany collaborated with Pilsudski and gave them the northern area of Slovakia, where these Ruthenians were living. And that's where my parents were living. And so my dad told me that when the Polish landlords came, they tell them, well, my father had been fishing in the Poprad River, which is right through the village. And they fished there for 20 years and never had any pay anything. But when the Polish landlords came, they said, you got to pay us to fish now. And so my dad and a group of other men from the village said, oh, the hell with these Polish landlords. They're just, illegal. So they went to fish in Nanich. One of the village men went and tattled to the police in Starolobovna. And they came and arrested my dad and threw him in jail for 30 days for fishing, in the Slovakian waters. And they were charged by the Polish landlords. And so they brought their damn illegal laws in Slovakia. So my dad remembered that very well. But moving on, the area was liberated and given to Ukraine. And so for 20 years, these Polish landlords ruled over Western Ukraine until they were liberated by the Soviet forces in '39. Well, how did these Polish landlords treat these Western Ukrainians? Well, they weren't allowed to have any Ukrainian schools, only Polish schools. They had no right to have any members elected to the Polish Diet. And they only could have very small plots of 5 hectares, very small, and most of the lands were controlled by the big Polish landlords, who are also known as kulaks. In 1929, some Western Ukrainians formed the OUN, which is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And they said its goal was to protect Ukrainians from repression. But there was a group of these Ukrainian nationalists who were headed by Bandera, who was Ukrainian. And his goal was committed to having a fascist Europe. He wanted to have Europe to be fascist. So, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, I'm sorry, the OUN, Banderas, they offered to join the German army. But Himmler said, oh no, we don't want these guys in here. Why? Because the German position was that they're Ukrainian. They're subhuman. They're not Aryans. They can't belong to our army. However, in 1943, after Stalingrad, And after 2 million men were lost in the German army, suddenly Himmler and the Nazi leadership decided they need more men. They needed more men, so they said, okay, they told Bandera's group, okay, you can join. And they formed a group called the SS Waffen Galicia. And they had a swastika. They had an emblem, which is N with a line through it. Now, I'm going to tell you in a little while why that's important. But the Ukrainians had during the war, they had a very strong underground. They had a very strong underground, and one of their main partisans was Sidor Kovpak, and he started organizing Ukrainian communists to fight against the Nazis, not to fight with the Nazis. And he was very famous because he established the guerrilla tactics in the Ukraine. They were only fight after dark. Sleep in the woods. Don't go a long way in one direction. Always change your direction. And get the village peasants on your side. And light the fire or flame in them. Well, he defeated the Nazis in Spasteki Woods and Putulich in Ukraine. And in Putulich, there was a famous ambush there, and they blew up 5 bridges, destroyed troop trains. The Nazis going to Volhynia, Lvov, and Radolia. And in 42 and 43, Kovak moved to the Carpathian Mountains, Carpathian Russian mountains. There were 2,000 guerrillas there. They destroyed 19 military trains, 52 bridges, and 51 warehouses. Well, 2 of my uncles fought with the partisans in Slovakia. Michael Murcko and Jan Murcko. And I spoke to both of them, and they said that, yeah, they had blown up the bridge right outside of Starolovna. And one time, they were supposed to blow up a troop train that was coming from Prešov and going to Warsaw. And so they destroyed the railroad track and the train came through. The only problem is the Nazis outsmarted them. Instead of sending a troop train, they sent a passenger train. But when the troop train came, some hours later, they took that out of commission. And this activity in Slovakia was very important because it was one of the main lines from Berlin to Kursk. I don't know if anybody knows about the Battle of Kursk. It was the biggest tank battle of the war. And so these partisans under Kovak were destroying a lot of military trains and equipment, and it had a lot of significance, moral significance, to the Soviet army. Oh, by the way, some people make a mistake. They think the army in the Soviet Union is called the Red Army. Well, it was only called the Red Army until the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922. After that, it's called the Soviet Army. And Kovak in 1943 was awarded the Medal Hero of the Soviet Union for his work in helping at the Battle of Kursk and destroying all these railroad tracks and sowing confusion on enemy forces. And there's another great military man Malinovsky. He was a great general, Ukrainian general. And why was he famous? Well, at the Battle of Stalingrad, there was a counteroffensive, and the forces under Rakovsky and Konev encircled the 6th Army under General Paulas. And so the German General Staff called on General Manstein, who was probably the most famous general, said, "You got to liberate the 6th Army." So he brought in his forces to attack the circle and liberate the 6th Army. Well, this is where Malinowski, who was head of the 2nd Guard, an elite unit of the Soviet Army, in the Kuban, they called on him to attack the forces of Manstein. And he was in the Kuban, held in reserve. And the 2nd Guard marched to Kolanivka, where the battle was with Manstein. In 24 hours, they marched over 100 miles in the snow, and defeated Manstein. Now, moving on to the, here. Now with the Ukraine, I'm getting back to the Ukraine now. The period between 1991 and 2010. What was going on in the former Soviet Union? Well, in 1991, Yeltsin engaged in a counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. He had the tanks from Tula attack the Russian Duma, and hundreds of people were killed in Moscow. And a lot of these people who were managers of these companies under the communists seized the resources of these companies and sold it to the US and the EU. According to this great article by Fidel, he said in 1995, over $500 billion worth of nickel, magnesium, and iron ore were on the docks in Amsterdam, waiting to be sold to the USA. And a lot of these functionaries became oligarchs in these different republics. Well, the same thing was true of Ukraine. In the 1990s, the former Prime Minister Pavlo Lashchenko joined forces with Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, we heard a lot about Yulia Tymoshenko. She was the CEO of United Energy System, a big gas company in the Ukraine. And they both, Lazarenko and Tymoshenko, became millionaires. Well, let me tell you something about another cultural thing. Anybody with the name K.O. at the end means they're Ukrainian. Lukashenko, Ukrainian. Tymoshenko, Ukrainian. Anyway, she was a damn oligarch. She was an oligarch, and she formed a group in 1999 called Ukraine Without Kuchma, because Kuchma was the president, was stealing like hell, and all called the Front for National Salvation. Well, Russia was giving gas at below the market price to Ukraine in the 1990s. And so what did Tymoshenko do? She took that gas and sold it to Great Britain and pocketed all the money. Pocketed her. She became, according to Forbes, she's the third richest woman in the world, stealing Russian gas, claiming she's against the oligarchy. and you want to know something interesting? Victoria Nuland loves Tymoshenko. She wanted Tymoshenko to be the new president of Ukraine after they got rid of Yanukovych. Yeah. But anyhow.
Did she refuse? Did she not? She was in jail. Oh.
No, the EU was against it. She said this woman's a crook because in 2011 she was convicted of embezzlement for stealing all that money from the Ukrainian gas company. But anyhow, so she formed a group, what she called the dissident oligarchs. But you know who they were funded by, Tymoshenko's group? That formed the Orange Revolution? George Soros. George Soros, the IRI, National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID. Now, George Soros has been working to overthrow the governments in Eastern Europe since 1990. And he first started in Yugoslavia by attacking Milosevic as being a bandit and a Serbian rapist. Well, he formed a group, I think, Petko, and they sent a lot of money to them, but they were successful. Well, they did the same thing in Georgia. Formed a group in Georgia to get rid of Shevchenko because they weren't doing what the EU wanted. Now he's doing the same thing in the Ukraine. George Soros is behind the Orange Revolution. Well, the Orange Revolution succeeded in getting Viktor Yushchenko elected. He was pro-EU and wanted more ties with the EU rather than with Russia. He won for one term in 2006. But in 2010, he was involved in so much corruption that he was voted out, and the president was elected. Now here's something else that's very important. I'll tell you I was going to do that. The far-right parties. In 1991, Ukraine formed a social nationalist party in Lvov. Membership was restricted to ethnic Ukrainians. No atheists or former communists were allowed. It's one of its program. Its program was to defend itself as irreconcilable enemy of communist ideology. This is, turmeric in those people. So, in 1999, they established a paramilitary organization called the Patriots of Ukraine. Now, remember I told you about that insignia that the Wolfen SS had? Well, these Patriots of Ukraine, they adopted that symbol. It's an N for Nazi with a slash in the middle. And if you saw some of these programs on the YouTube, you see that people that were armed in Independence Square. I'm not going to call it Euromaidan, because that's the word given to by these neo-Nazis. But Independence Square is what it was since 1917, so I'm going to call it Independence Square. And Tony Book was the head, the leader of SNPU. They changed his name to the Svoboda Party, from Social Nationalist, which is really another word for the Nazi Party, to Svoboda.